Hello there. Today is the 21st of March 2024, and I'm going to talk about the relationship between the United States and Europe in geopolitics, and this is the reason why. Well, first of all, do you know that old fable from Aesop? Aesop, the 6th century BC. You remember the tortoise and the hare, all that. Okay, he has a fable about the fox and the grapes. Do you know that one? Okay, so once upon a time there was a fox, and as he was walking along, he saw this vine with beautiful, juicy grapes, wonderful grapes, yummy, really tasty grapes. And so he grasped for them but couldn't reach them. And he tried and he tried and he tried and he couldn't. And then he started jumping, but he still couldn't get to them. And after trying for so long, the fox just turned around and said, "Huh, they weren't even ripe anyway." All right, so I want you to keep this in mind. I was listening to the Duran. I know you follow them. Most of you follow them. It's a good channel, yeah. And Alexander Mercouris from London started his video yesterday by saying about the this thing about Macron, the president of France, sending French deployments to the Ukraine. And he quoted Narinsky, the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, which is sort of equivalent to our secret service, the spy agency, as it were. So that France was sending, he said, 2,000 troops to the Ukraine, and that this actually elicited a very strong denial from the French ministry, saying that such a plan did not exist. All right, but at the same time, he was talking about reports from French military officials, former ministry officials, discussing actually on French television that such plans do actually exist. And there are plans to deploy 20,000, not 2,000, 20,000 men along to Ukraine to act as a sort of a tripwire, a sort of a red line to prevent Russians advancing. And then Mercouris points to a tweet by Medvedev. I don't know that I'm pronouncing it properly. I'm obviously not. Medvedev. Okay, the former president of Russia, the former prime minister of Russia, now deputy chair of Russia's Security Council. And in his tweet, he says, basically the attitude is, well, bring it on. And then some of his comments where he says, actually, for the success of our cause, it would be nice if the French dispatched regiments to Bandeiraland. And it would be very problematic then to hide such a large number of servicemen. So systematically eliminating them, he says, would not be a difficult task. But just think of the beneficial knock-on effects. They will no longer be able to get away, he says, the Europeans, with such lame excuses, such as that they are mercenaries, or that mercenaries choose their own fate, or that mercenaries are risking their lives at their own discretion, and so on. And then he adds, Medvedev, as for the Gallic roosters, the French leaders, he's obviously talking about Macron, it would be tantamount to being guillotined. And a good lesson, he adds, for other rambunctious fools in Europe. And then he finishes off his tweet by quoting Pushkin, the Russian poet, 19th century, where he talks about, he says, by all means, send in your troops to our Russian plains, and they will be sent to a room to slumber. So I went to the Pushkin poem, and yes, I found this sort of the quote. It is from a poem titled "To the Slanderers of Russia," and in a little bit he says, quote, "Then send your numbers without number, your maddened sons, your goaded slaves. In Russia's plains there is room to slumber, and well they'll know their brethren's graves." That's Pushkin. So I was listening to all this, so I said, okay, let me go back and check what is going on in French television channels and YouTube channels and so on, to see what they are saying. I find that it seems as if the majority of the French people are very much against this. So, as I usually do, I tend to synthesize and summarize what several channels say. And usually I find I have mentioned this before, that I find that there is a channel, Tocsin. I'll put the name, not with an X, Tocsin, which I have mentioned before. And they are talking about a number of things, and interviewing two professors, authors, and so on. So they started talking about, first of all, about the Russian election. And as a matter of curiosity, who has and who has not, which country actually congratulated Putin, who won 80% of the vote. And they say, but the whole West has come up against him, Putin, and, just sort of marking their distance. All NATO's countries seem to be following the same cue, except perhaps for Erdogan and Orban from Turkey and Hungary. The rest, for example, they quote Charles Orban, the president of the European Council, not the Commission, okay, the Council, which is made up of each country's ministers representing each country. And they quote this Charles Orban, the president of this European Council, who came up with a very sarcastic comment, à la French, as it were, before the election took place. Before, not after. And before the election, he says, "I would like to congratulate Mr. Putin for his decisive victory." As I said, before the election. In other words, he was already criticizing the process, everyone who voted for him. Mainly he was saying no opposition, no choice, no freedom. He calls it a false democracy, sort of, the Russians' incapacity to know what democracy is or is not. And okay, but, if we're going to talk about elections, well, let's leave that point aside for the time being. European leaders who are questioning this, it's not that they know, it's not that they don't know that they're lying. I think of course, they do know. But that's the thing, it seems to me, that the more we see our shortcomings or our problems or our divisions or lies or whatever, it seems that the more we are aware of ourselves, the more we blame Putin for it. I find this psychologically most interesting. Many months ago, I posted a video about this. I was talking about Trump in particular, saying in rather strong terms, perhaps, that I said Trump was like the bucket into which America and Europe spew their undigested vomit. That is not to say that these two individuals, Trump and Putin, are perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it is saying that their accusers might not be perfect either. So what the American reaction, what the Americans are saying, is that it was an incredibly undemocratic process. The Americans are saying this, that it was an incredibly undemocratic process. That is what Mr. Patel said. He's a spokesman for the American Department of State. Perhaps Mr. Blinken couldn't come up and say that himself. He would probably burst out laughing or something. So increasingly we are seeing that minorities and women come up and give these statements. Perhaps they don't want to say themselves, the leaders, and be on record. But he says, Mr. Patel, I think we can say that there will probably not be a congratulatory call from the United States, he continued. We took note of the victory of Vladimir Putin, affirming sort of in an oblique, sort of indirect way that conditions for a free election had not been met. In Germany, too, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Annalena, what's her name, showing her total disdain, this is not by any means the first time, her contempt for Russia. She spoke of a, quote, simulacrum of democracy. Big words for Annalena. Alex Christoforous calls at the 360 degrees, Annalena. But anyway, it seems that all NATO and the press and so on are in line with this. Okay, so, but we saw the view from Red Square, where thousands upon thousands of people, they were singing their national anthem, they were waving flags and so on. This is not to say that this huge meeting was not organized. Of course, it needs organization. But you know, I don't think that anyone put a gun to their head to go there. Come on. So then they criticized the fact that Mr. Putin had security around him, and they interpreted this. They said, "Oh, that's because he's afraid of his own people, This is not fair, really. I mean, you know, when you think of the American president, wherever he goes, he takes behind. I mean, behind him are 15, 20 cars, you know, but." They said this, Putin is in danger from his own people and he's afraid and so on. I don't think that's fair. So anyway, let's be coherent a little bit, okay? Let's, apart from these idiocies, what I'm saying is that all our doubts, uncertainties, fears, the divisions in the West, it seems that all of it is being projected onto Putin. And the question is, to me, are we right in always going against Russia in this manner? Because sometimes I even see it as rather vulgar, actually. Going against Russia, well, perhaps in this or that or the other thing, but in this manner, you know. Now, I saw this interview with an author, Nicholas Miskovich. He's the author of Ukrainian Chaos, one book, and another book, The American Empire. And he says that there is a cognitive, purposeful war going on at the moment between, let us call it, he says, the globalist Atlanticist camp, the Anglo camp. They in France they refer to it like that, which advocates an ideology of Euro-Atlanticism, which has in fact designated Russia as its enemy. And we know Americans need an enemy to focus their strategy. We know that. And there is this one camp, and then the other side, Russia, which is an Eurasian country, but European for sure, and which happens to have an alternative model. Certainly, the EU is totally integrated into this global Anglo-Atlanticist camp, as he calls it, as well as all the European periphery dominated by Washington. Now, all the governments of the member states, except perhaps Hungary and Slovakia now, have this anti-Russian narrative because he feels that Russia has in some way become the scapegoat for all the problems of this greater West, which has a fault line in this geopolitical arena and has been in retreat since 2015. In fact, since Russia came to the aid of Syria. And he maintains that this camp is losing ground in the geopolitical arena, and he explains why he thinks so. So an election, a plebiscite of this magnitude of the Russian people vis-a-vis Putin does not please, so it's actually can be quite scary to them. Why? Because Russia seems to be actually united. Even if there are different opinions about policies, many Russians have been favorable to the EU, for example, as Putin had been, and to NATO as Putin had been. But they are all united in this war. And the war has changed all that. And these, let's say, westernized Russians nevertheless now support Russia. This split in Russian society goes back to Peter the Great, and think of all the Dostoevsky's complaint. He was pulling his hair out, blaming the intellectuals for always imitating the West and despairing and despising and putting aside their own Russian roots, and he was very much against that. That's Dostoevsky. So this goes back a long time. But the fact is that at the moment they seem to be united. Why so? Because the Russians know that if Russia were to lose, that would mean the dismantling of Russia, partitioning of Russia in different entities, as the US wanted to do back in the 1990s. And it would mean a sort of a geopolitical transformation, fragmentation. And Russia would become yet another protectorate of the West, English style, during her empire. The attitude was you don't need actually to take the whole country. You just insert little pockets of, influencers, as it were. Insert a protectorate here and a little bit of a nation there, so that they could rest assured that they would satisfy their political needs whenever they arose. So the EU countries are not sovereign countries, he says, because they are actually under the American nuclear umbrella, and so the media, parrot-like, repeats always the official narrative. So Russia is in the crosshairs of this globalist, Anglo-Atlanticist camp, world, for a single reason. Because he maintains that Russia does not submit or accept this international, meaning America, this international rules-based order, the American rules-based order. That is to say, Russia does not submit or accept to America being the sole hegemon in the world, the one dominant power. Strategy that America and the European political caste now, together with South Korea and Australia and Japan, this has been going on since World War II. And this project is a project where, in this globalist ideology, there are no borders, not really, to speak of, okay? And it is the US reigning supreme. And this is a project dictated by the American elite that, by the way, one could argue that at the moment is playing its hand not very well, in fact perhaps rather badly. A project that for America and its friends is a project that demands access to natural resources from the other countries. And Russia had tried to play this game when the Soviet Union fell in the 1990s. It actually made a lot of efforts, like the other Eastern European countries did. They are now on board, of course, but Russia did try to work that time to collaborate with the European Union. Go and see Gorbachev, so many speeches when he talks about the new European architecture or something like that. Architecture doesn't translate well. It's a new European structure. Gorbachev had wanted, obviously, to bring down the Cold War, and Putin at the beginning wanted to be Russia to be a part of the European Union and of NATO. He wanted to be accepted, but this was not the world really that the United States wanted. It wanted to advance its power through NATO's bases, closer and closer to Russia, as we know. So, in a way, they needed Russia as an enemy, but Russia wanted to become part of the EU. The EU, as we know, has American roots. It was the US that wanted for the European Economic Community at the time to take place. The Europeans perhaps not so happy with it, but they were finally convinced. And basically the European Union, we could say, is now an American protectorate. So this globalist agenda is, the American empire over alles, as it were. The problem is that Russia resisted this now. And there are many countries in the world that would like to, if they could, would like to resist too as well. Because these other countries, there are many countries in the world that would like this, because these countries are used as tools, as it were, put there after World War II. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, etc., etc. What do they do, these organizations? Well, they ask all these countries, to basically deregulate their economies. They ask them to sell their assets to us, and the West, behind these multinational organizations, one could argue that they are to a certain extent exploiting the local, the national resources of these smaller countries. They're overwhelmed with debt, and in order to be able to repay their debts, they told them you need to rebuild your countries, not only economically but culturally. One recent example was, for example, the abortion issue in Argentina about 3 years ago. You want more money from us? Well, then, there is this little problem there with abortion. You need to incorporate it in your constitution and so on. Wouldn't it be nice if it was resolved? And yeah, that is, it's a question of dividing countries along these cultural fault lines. What that does is to eventually create division within the countries, and that division, if not resolved, leads to chaos and sometimes even to civil war in these countries. And of course, they just made it clear that, of course, you're going to sell us your natural resources. And you're either for us or you are against us. And if you don't do it, that means that what we ask of you, that means that you are against us. And so then you have color revolutions and the positions of head of state and sanctions, etc., etc. Most countries cannot afford to go through this. But Russia resisted. And from that moment, Russia or Putin, you need just the one individual easier to dislike. Soft word. Okay. So at the moment, it's almost as if Russia were the least democratic government in the world. But even if it had been the most democratic country in the world, it would still be the same. Our attitude to Russia would still be the same. So they just, want to bring it down for the same reason. That Russia is resisting this globalist, Anglo-Atlanticist idea. And that is, which for the West, the ideal situation would have been for Russia to provide natural resources which we, could exploit, and we would make our profits, or not their profits, on the backs of Russians. And that, to my mind, is what Putin finally understood. Now, Ukraine, which until 2015 everyone in the West acknowledged as one of the most corrupt countries, has also cancelled its legislative and presidential elections, which were due now in March, and some political parties' representatives were ejected from the assembly. So what we have here, therefore, is a democracy Russian style or democracy Ukraine style. Okay, and let's look in the EU, for example. Ursula von der Leyen is unelected, and she's a pawn. Is a particularly warlike lady. Some argue a pawn to American interest. My point is that imagine if Europe was governed according to what is best for Europe. Imagine for a moment, I know it's difficult, but humor me for a second. Imagine if, seems impossible, but imagine if Russia had been accepted into the European Union, which of course it didn't. The moment, the Russians started asking, would that be possible? Europe turned up their nose and said, well, no. But imagine if it had come to pass you would have Europe together with Russia, the western part European, the eastern part Asian. So you would have a Europe with an open door to Asia. And what would you have now? You would have a very strong and powerful Europe, if that had been possible. So you would have surely a multipolar world, because you would have Europe plus Russia with an open door to the east. Then you would have here the United States, obviously with its allies, Israel and Japan, South Korea. I don't know about Australia. Australia could probably play the role that Erdogan, with Turkey, play both sides. I don't know, but and then you would have China and its area of regional influence and so on. So my point is that Europe could have become a powerhouse. So this was not acceptable to the United States, obviously. So they had to separate Europe from Russia in order to continue to be the major player in the world. The European Union decided not to do this. And at the moment, Ursula's decisions are obviously dictated. And we keep saying that we are the paragons of democracy. But we do have unelected officials ourselves. I mean, the European Commission is not elected. The Parliament is elected, but they have no power at all. They can speak for 1 or 2 minutes or 3 or whatever, but I mean, they basically have to accept what the Commission puts to them. Okay, and it's almost there for show, the European Parliament. We had, if you remember, referenda in France and Ireland when the European community, an economic bloc, was changing into a political thing, becoming the European Union, and with a constitution. And if you remember, a lot of countries voted against it. Ireland, France, Denmark, I think, too. But what they did was they just went right along. They didn't take any notice. Instead of calling it the Constitution, they called it the Treaty or something or other. But they just went along, and it became the European Union. Now, so democracy, okay. Look, Macron, for example, was elected on the first round with 30% of the registered voters, and those in the legislature from his own party got 13%. We could also, some of us have questions about elections in many other countries, In Britain, we have a prime minister who has not been elected. Elected to be prime minister. So the point is that those in power understand how the democratic system works today, obviously. And they are using it, or perhaps misusing it, or perhaps malusing it, to retain that power. And I guess that if we were a true democracy as we used to be, I mean, more or less in my youth, we could express ourselves without fear. We could talk about, at the moment we can't talk openly about many different subjects, as you know. But why people who have different, who want to express different opinions to the powerful, to their leaders, are not allowed, for example, not really in mainstream discussions and debates and so on. But nevertheless, in spite of all this, we continue to be to give lessons to the rest of the world on democracy. And we have Julian Assange there, okay, who has not been charged with anything, but nevertheless he is in solitary confinement and all this. And what he did really was to expose the crimes, many crimes committed by, the people in power and so on. So I don't know. 100 years from now, if we are alive, they'll probably think that at this moment in time we were being led by crazies. It feels sometimes as if we are being led to a wall, that is the direction that we're being led. But not only economically, but the societal and the economic, but also the moral and the spiritual level. And nevertheless, we go around giving lessons to people who are finally perhaps able to breathe a little bit economically, who are sometimes even experiencing a spiritual rebirth, who have, after decades, who have a project of their own for their people and their own country, who are in the process of rebuilding their infrastructure and their hospitals and their schools. And this is not only in Russia, but in Africa, in South America and so on. So we feel, nevertheless, I do, that the West is on a gradual, perhaps not so gradual, slippery slope to utter decadence. Our politicians lying straight to our faces, looking at us in the eyes. But, perhaps it's not slow or gradual, perhaps it's actually rapid and quite accelerated now. But we continue to go around sort of giving lessons on democracy. This is extremely serious. It really should not be taken lightly, because we are making enemies. In Western Europe, we have this feeling that Russia somehow is not worthy of something, our attention, of entering into this European concert. She shouldn't be seen with us as the respectable powers. Russia is too far. This all comes from, in Europe, from this Westernist superiority complex that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, perhaps even to the split between the Western Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire in the East, in other words, Rome and Byzantium. And this seems to have been transferred to America now, and this is now the Pax Romana, Pax Americana. The Americanization is a sort of a post-democracy, a conflict of civilizations. And sometimes it feels, certainly to me, that the more frightened they are, the more aggressive they become. And they are angry and perhaps even afraid, because Russia, besides everything else, is actually represents an alternative model. It's sort of a Europe of nations based on individual countries' sovereignty, anchoring it on its civilization. Russia considers itself a civilization, and obviously there are others. So there are many who see the world divided into civilizations. So you have perhaps the Northern European and then perhaps the Southern European, which is slightly different, perhaps not so much, but certainly different. Then you have China, another civilization, and you have the Middle East, another civilization, and so on and so forth. So sees that some people see the world, allow each civilization to flourish and then trade with each other. Look, in this question of the Russian election, there are maps there. Just as an example of the countries that have congratulated Putin and those who have not. For example, there are two maps according to population. Okay, needless to say, these are not the people of these countries voting, that is the leaders of those countries. But okay, even the leaders of this country, according to the population of their countries. The ones who congratulated Putin is, say, 51.4%. The ones who critique the election or condemned the election is 15.8%. And then there is a whole bunch of no reaction or neutral, or they didn't want to say, and that is 31%. That is according to population. Now, according to GDP, it's completely different. The ones, it shows the economic force, strength of these countries. The ones, according to the GDP, the countries that congratulated Putin amount to 26.4%. The ones who critique or condemned in some way the election, 59.4%, and no reaction, 12.1%. So here we see that the picture is completely different. It's a big difference here. But nevertheless, it shows that the countries that are being now reborn, as it were, are in the process of gaining power. For example, the BRICs and their GDP could very well be reversed. But instead of that, if we look at the purchasing parity, not the GDP, but the actual the purchasing parity is obviously much more important, because you're talking here about the wages and the salaries and what people can actually afford to buy with those salaries. Okay, you can earn a huge salary in the West compared to in other countries, but after you pay your mortgage, your groceries and everything else, how much money do you have? Can you save or spend on a holiday and so on? And people say that, for example, in the United States, the majority of the people would not be able to get $1,000 just like that in a case of emergency. Okay, so even if you earn a lot, if you have to pay a lot, you may not be better off. This is easy to understand, yes, that in a country that pays you lower wages, but nevertheless the food and the house and so on is much, much lower too, you may end up with more money at the end of the month. Even comparing it to the West, earning a meager salary, you can still afford, to save a little bit. So when this purchasing power parity is the PPP, is actually the important one that tells you the economic health of the country. Well, if you look at that, and these are figures from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, looking at the growth rate, actually, Russia is the first in the Eurozone. The Eurozone growth rate is 0.5%. 0.5%, and that is not taking account inflation. Inflation has been taken out. Okay, in the US is 2.5%. Russia is at the moment 3.5%, despite the 1,400 sanctions, despite the war. So what seems clear is that if you look at the reality of the situation, there is a new world coming into existence. The world that we had since World War II is changing, is coming to an end. Many countries, smaller countries, not powerful countries, have not been happy for a long time about the situation in the world, the geopolitical situation. They feel that an economic model was imposed on them, that economic model did not benefit them. But the problem was that if you went against it, you would have sanctions or color revolutions or overthrow of your government in the name of democracy and human rights and so on, whatever. But this is about money and it's about markets. And when countries resisted this also social engineering demanded of them changes organized from Washington. Then if nothing worked, then all of a sudden they would have a war in their hands in their country. Okay, it's because, officially even, without counting all the covert operations, officially 500 wars since 1776. Many foreign interventions, most of them covert. And the fear that in these impoverished countries, sanctions could be imposed on them if you went against it. So there was this fear. They couldn't afford it. Okay? But the difference is that Russia decided that it would not go along with it anymore. Stop, they said, not here. So, and many countries that suffer from this game of causing them immense debts and so on, also have to introduce, all these forms of changes in their traditions, social engineering in their culture, the definition of marriage, the male-female relationships, to a very large extent, the destruction of their traditions and customs. And this leads inevitably to social chaos and division within the country, and finally, as I said, even civil wars. And these countries do not want these ideologies, that they don't like them, they do not support them. And frankly, many are totally fed up with these impositions. To quote the famous movie, we can't take it anymore. The BRICs are now almost half of the world's population, and they're growing in the number of countries that are interested in joining it. So I ask myself, why do we continue to do things for them to dislike us? I'm using a soft word here again, for them to dislike us. But the number of these countries is growing. It is clear that there is a new world coming now into existence, which is not ideological. So the question is, it's about economics. So the question is, why is the US and the globalist Anglo, what was the term, Anglo Atlanticist camp trying so hard to make enemies of them? At the beginning, I remember when I was young, in the 60s and 70s, when the United States was never referred to in terms of empire. The American empire, sort of, that thing didn't exist, except for de Gaulle, but it didn't really exist. But sometimes I would hear it, and my reaction to that always was, in the United States defense. Look, if it is an empire, it surely is one of the better ones that existed in the world. I saw the benefits of the West economically and so on, and I just, if you're going to criticize an empire, okay, but it didn't seem to me to be the worst at all. There have been many others much worse. But because America after the war, they said at the beginning that it would extend to all the American way of life based on Christian values, they said. Okay, so, but in any case, de Gaulle, the president of France said in the 1960s that the gravest danger to Europe was American imperialism. That's what he said. I find it amazing that he used this term in the 60s. No one spoke at that time as America as an imperial power. He did. But we were happy with America. America would defend us. And we believed and shared the same values, and perhaps we did. But the point is that these values have been changing little by little for quite a while. And these values are now, the main value is, total hegemony, the US model to be the only one, the dominant model. And it will, impose, dictate its laws, impose its rules to just about everybody else. And it doesn't seem to respect other people's traditions, the specific traditions of other cultures. And I don't think that's a good thing. It doesn't provide lots of friends. It encourages a certain amount of fear because of the sanctions that you can impose. But you see, the BRICs therefore are based on a different model. Think of these countries: the United Arab Emirates, Russia, China, Brazil, all these countries, they're different governments, different religions, different traditions. What they have in common is that they want to function in the economic sphere, to function in the world economically. But they want to continue to being able to preserve their identity. They just want an economic flow, among themselves, among each one of them, regardless of their own particular individual traditions. And this is a new thing. This is a new style, a new model. They are building a different model. So what has happened is that Russia created, or is helping to create, a competitor model to that of the United States. A model that is not based economically on the dollar, which is the pillar of the United States model. Americans, you see, can print all the money they want. But they do have about $43 trillion in debt, public and private. And the rest of the world, of course, pays every time you trust the dollar. So now these countries are now trading in their own in rubles or yuan. The dollar has been weakened. And that is one of the reasons why we must go against Russia. We must denounce Russia. Probably because America is failing in many areas. And why? Because many countries have decided to go in a different direction. And by doing so, they have not done anything illegal. They have not done anything contrary to international law. They just want to exchange in their own particular currencies. But they do not want to be under American surveillance through its tools, for example, the SWIFT, for example, by which America knows and has access to all international transactions. And the Brussels model of the European Union is monitored by the US. And some countries have said enough. What happens to the country that criticizes this globalist Anglo-Atlanticist camp model? Well, they are sort of demons, anti-democratic and so on, bad. They don't respect human rights, they don't respect democracy, etc., etc. So it would be, a good idea perhaps for us to, in Europe, to take a step back and, in this world that is moving and changing, that is a reality. Perhaps each European country should ask, what is in our own interest? Do we continue to be led ahead, straight ahead against the wall there? Continue to close our eyes? Shall we continue to blindly to follow Americans in every way, in everything, even when America itself is divided, culturally divided? These countries, for example, in Uganda, the US would give Uganda additional subsidies and so on if they introduced homosexual marriage into their constitution. In other words, other countries are expected, they have to exchange, they have to change their culture. And when that happens, not the whole country would go along with it, what I said before. So there would be, therefore, a lack of cohesion. And who would benefit from this? Since eventually these would perhaps ultimately lead to civil wars. And this is extremely harmful, but war anyway seems to have been turned into a profit-making exercise, so good for business, which is horrific. And it's leading the world into a precipice. And it's not only economically, the spiritual levels of understanding life, etc., are in our countries at their lowest possible level. I mean, the narcissism, the nihilism, the dying sometimes rapidly, sometimes gradually and very slowly through external addictions and loneliness. To sort of summarize, we are now facing a change in the geopolitical configuration of the world. This is nothing new. This happens almost every 100 years or so. Remember, in the 1600s, the Treaty of Westphalia. Okay, that is when, this thing that we had, that we just go and conquer lands and take a bit of this and a bit of this country. No, you can no longer do that. Okay, countries had their own borders. It didn't mean that you were not going to get into wars about disagreements and so on, but you couldn't just go in and conquer lands, you know. So that was Westphalia. That was following the 30-year war in Europe. Then we had the Napoleonic invasions. Then at the beginning of the 20th century, with President Wilson of the United States, we had the Concert of Nations. Then we had the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. Then we had the outcome of the Second World War, with the US and the Soviet Union and Britain sort of rearranging the map of Europe. Then we had the United Nations and the Security Council that changed things. Then we had in the 1990s the fall of the USSR, the Soviet Union, that changed the landscape again. Then we had the unipolar moment, the unipolar world, the United States alone as a superpower, which I think she mishandled it. Looking back is always easy with hindsight, but had they gone in a different direction, not to impose their power, but to go in a different way, the world might have been different. But in any case, so now we have the emergence of a world that could be either bipolar or multipolar according to civilization. If you want, it depends how you look at it. If you could see the great divide between the American model and the BRICs model. So that would be a bipolar world, okay? Or you can look at it from a different prisms in terms of civilization. So you have the United States, and especially Northern Europe, Southern Europe, perhaps South America are a little bit different, but in any case, different civilization. The Middle East would be a different civilization. Russia sees itself as a different civilization. China sees itself as a different civilization. In other words, you have powers, great powers, each keeping their own civilization, but still being able to trade, as it were. So we are leading into, we are going to either a bi or a multipolar world in any case. Now, what is an international order? I'm not talking about the rules-based international order, which is the American one, but just an international order. What is that? In general terms, is an order that is an order that is accepted more or less to a greater or a lesser extent, but generally accepted among the great powers to maintain in the world at least temporary stability and at least try to avoid conflict. That is the international law. But right now what we have is a problem. The great problem that we have is that the great powers do not agree on this international order for all. And what is emerging is this bi or multipolar world, that is to say, two or more great powers together in the world. And the American or the Americanized West, NATO and its protectorate, which in Europe, and Australia and the Anglo countries, and also the Indo-Pacific, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and the rest. If we look at a map, we can see clearly the U.S. strategy. This Atlanticist politics to control the continent, the European continent, this fragmentation between Europe and Asia, to maintain the European, the hegemonic dominance of the European side, so that Russia never reaches the ocean and challenges the US. That's one side. And the other side, we have the Indo-Pacific Rim to counter China. But one could argue that this model is beginning to crack, because the countries of Asia, led by Russia and China, we didn't want Russia to be part of Europe, and then the end result is now you have Russia and China. And these countries in Asia, led by Russia and China, a lot of them kind of refuse now this Western dominance with Washington at the center, and have in fact made the tactical alliance to remove American influence from Eurasia, and obviously sought partnerships elsewhere. So Russia sought to go back to that classical model, well before the war, to that classical model in Europe of a Europe of nations. But Europe, one could argue under American influence, did not accept this. And now there is this great divide between Russia and Europe. Putin has often said in his speeches that he is against this collective West under American domination, but would be ready to negotiate with European countries freed from American dominance. I don't think he holds this view anymore. This was in the past. But European countries, he would like to negotiate with European countries that could reason as sovereign states a new, what he called a new architecture, as I said. It's a new sort of Euro and Asia sort of structure, a policy of perhaps equilibrium and balance that could be of interest to Europe. And Russia could have brought Asia along instead of Europe locking itself up as an annex in the periphery now of power under US dominance, which, by the way, uses Europe, or might use Europe, we don't know, having practically exhausted the Ukraine regime against Russia. And hopefully European countries will not be expected to take the place of Ukrainians against Russia, not to put Europeans at the front, the Poles or the this or the that, whoever. It looks as if we are acting as vassals. The European leaders obedient, no one reasoning beyond what is in front of their nose. The EU, a subset of NATO, which prevents cooperation between Europe and Russia. And the elites of London, Paris, Berlin, it could have been also Moscow, but no, these elites are, however, out of step with the peoples of Europe. But Putin saw this new European structure as a circle of cooperation between Europe and Asia to actually counterbalance the United States. It did not happen because Europe could not go along with it. So, in our best interest, perhaps we should begin to think about negotiating a rapprochement and understanding with Russia to try to negotiate a way out of this crisis in Ukraine, which is really the local focal point of American strategy of dividing Europe. And our governments in Europe, most of them are actually in a minority in parliaments and assemblies. And from the point of view of legitimacy, are now practically in a headlong flight, because they did lie to us for the last 2 years. Russia has lost, Ukraine has won, and this was false, and it is false on the ground, and it is false in world geopolitics, because the alliances have changed the world order. They have changed since the Russian intervention in Syria, when the West went against Bashar al-Assad, and Russia came to his aid. And then we have the withdrawal from Afghanistan, then the Russian intervention in the Ukraine, to avoid that Ukraine entered NATO and established itself as an anti-Russian state, with all those American bases right there at the Russian border, with NATO support. In other words, it was to transform Ukraine into an anti-Russian state. Europe here following the American bidding, and now we have that NATO will no longer be able to expand and be used as an encirclement tool of Russia, apart from obviously Finland and Sweden, which were already in this alliance for all intents and purposes. Now they'll just have to pay for it. But I don't think there is a threat of Russian tanks coming to Berlin and Paris and London, but it nevertheless continues to be a sort of a selling point. So I'll finish as I started, that I think America has its own interest and follows its own interest. You've heard many times that famous sentence coined by Henry Kissinger, that to be an enemy of the United States was bad, but to be a friend could be even worse at times. But what we can be certain of is that America does things in its own interest. And if you're friendly, that's Europe, that's great. But if it's no longer in their interests, they'll leave, they'll go, and they will leave you hanging there, holding the bag, holding the baby. And I don't know that perhaps that is what is happening now. So that is why I started with the fable of the fox and the grapes. When you have tried everything and you're no longer in your interest to keep trying, well, you just say, well, the grapes aren't ripe anyway, and leave. Let me know what you think about all this. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.